Wrong bubble. Did I just alter the course of American politics as we know it? Who am I to say? All I know is that some scientists tell me. In the butterfly did it, the aberrant vote for Buchanan in Palm Beach County, Florida, 6 scientists ventured to prove that a new style of voting ballot caused the American people to accidentally elect George W. Bush for president instead of Al Gore in the United States presidential election of 2000. Welcome to the Academic Debrief, where papers like this one, written by highly qualified researchers that are also 18 pages long, become more palatable for vegans, vagabonds, those in ketosis, Catholics, and more. Our plan of attack is a savory, tact, and unbiased one. First, I'll describe the setting in which this paper was called to be written. Second, we'll get to know the authors of this paper. Third, we'll go over what these researchers claim. And finally, we'll talk about how they prove it. Once we commence with our plan of attack and eventually succeed in conquering this piece of academic literature, there'll be a small after-party where I serve digital snacks, drinks, and invite you to make conjectures. The year is 1999. Bill Clinton is president and Al Gore is vice president. Notable headlines from 1999 include the Senate starting the process of impeaching Bill Clinton, unemployment dropping to the lowest it had been since 1970, the Dow Jones closing above 10,000 for the first time, a tornado outbreak in Oklahoma featuring unseen wind speeds, the Columbine shooting, the U.S. turning over control of the Panama Canal to Panama, and Texas Governor George W. Bush announcing he will seek the Republican Party nomination for president. Oh, and the first episode of SpongeBob came out. The 2000 presidential election was between Democratic candidate Al Gore and Republican candidate George W. Bush. It may be important to note that George W. Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, was president in the late 80s and early 90s. Some popular headlines from George H.W. Bush's presidency include Operation Desert Storm, the dissolving of the Soviet Union, and the Immigration Act of 1990, where President Bush signed to allow for the admission of 700,000 aliens every year. I mention Bush Sr. because I imagine that if your father is president at the end of the Cold War, the winds might blow a certain way around the election. So, the son of a former president is running against the vice president. The 2000 presidential election was extremely close. When I say extremely close, I mean the entire election came down to the state of Florida, a swing state at the time, and was ultimately decided by a number of people who could fit in a Walmart. Knowing that this election was decided by 537 people, you might begin to see why this butterfly ballot is a big deal. Shall I say more? This is where our authors come in. With the Supreme Court eventually getting tied up in this presidential election and its validity, one might expect some pretty heavy hitters when proving this ballot decided the 2000 presidential election. And heavy hitters we got. This is practically the Avengers of American political science we're looking at right here, hailing from some of the most elite institutions of higher education in the world, including Cornell, Northwestern, Harvard, and UC Berkeley. Okay, so this is a normal voting ballot you might see in states like California, Texas, New York, Colorado, and Washington. Instead of using one of these ballots, Palm Beach County in Florida used a new ballot. This is the butterfly ballot. As read word for word in the abstract, these 6 scientists claimed that the butterfly ballot used in Palm Beach County, Florida, in the 2000 presidential election caused more than 2,000 Democratic Party voters to vote by mistake for Reform candidate Pat Buchanan. Do me a favor and guess how you would vote with this ballot. If you were just like these Palm Beach County voters in Florida and you wanted to vote for Al Gore, which bubble would you pick? If you chose this one, you'd be correct. What our scientists are trying to prove is that over 2,000 people who meant to vote for Gore accidentally did this instead. Which, as you may have guessed, means they accidentally voted for Pat Buchanan, the Reform political party candidate. By proving this correct, these scientists would show that this election should not have been decided by 537 votes, rather it should have been decided by over 1,500 votes and for the opposite candidate. To prove this claim, the scientists showed 2 main things. The amount of people voting for Pat Buchanan was strangely high in Palm Beach County on election day, and that most of these people were of the Democratic Party. So how could people tell that the number of votes received by Pat Buchanan was strangely high? Well, they looked at another county in Florida and saw that they weren't voting for Pat Buchanan. But comparing Palm Beach County to one other county is simply not enough. Because what if it's this one other county that has issues and not Palm Beach County? What our superhero squad of political scientists do is compare Palm Beach County to 3,053 other counties in the United States. Using the results of previous elections and the demographic characteristics of the counties, they're able to predict the number of votes for Buchanan in each one of these counties. And this is what they come up with. If you've taken high school math, you'll know that the x-axis that runs horizontally houses the independent variable, and the y-axis that runs vertically houses the dependent variable. Hey yo, but this don't look anything like Algebra 1. Alright, but stick with me. The dependent variable on this y-axis in this figure is called a residual. You get the residual by taking a number you expected and subtracting the actual number from it. So here, if the scientists predicted that in Alaska, 40 people voted for Pat Buchanan, and in reality only 35 people voted for Pat Buchanan, we are left with the residual of 5. They go on to do this for all the 3,053 counties and the 50 states that they tested, and they come up with this. Most of their residuals are between -5 and 20, producing a pretty tight grouping or range. Something you might also know from high school math are outliers. When your teacher made you learn mean, median, and mode, you also learned that averages can be affected by weirdly high or weirdly low numbers. In this picture, there are 2 outliers: Jasper County, South Carolina, and Palm Beach, Florida. Neither of these counties had been outliers before in other presidential elections, and while Florida was a swing state at the time, meaning that majority of Floridians shifted between political parties, the race in South Carolina was not close. Bush defeated Gore by 220,376 votes in South Carolina, so if all 6,469 presidential ballots that were cast in Jasper County went to Gore, they wouldn't have been enough to swing the state into Gore's favor anyway. But the reason Jasper County is an outlier is because of a bad voting machine. Now we know that Palm Beach County was indeed weird for voting so much for Pat Buchanan compared to the rest of the counties. The only difference between Palm Beach County and the other counties that we suspect is the butterfly ballot. But how do we know that the people who voted for Pat Buchanan actually meant to vote for Al Gore? Only if we could magically contact another group of voters in Palm Beach County who didn't use the butterfly ballot. Oh wait, we can. Only the people voting in person in the 2000 election used the butterfly ballot. The people who sent in their ballots using the mail did not use the butterfly ballot. So if the people who mailed in their choice for president were feeling Pat Buchanan, maybe there wasn't a mistake after all. What our scientists do is subtract the number of people who voted for Buchanan with the absentee ballot from the number of people who voted for him in person. So let's say 10 people vote for Pat Buchanan. If 8 of those people voted for Pat Buchanan using the butterfly ballot in person, and 2 of them voted for Pat Buchanan using the mail-in ballot, we're left with 6. If we scale that up and include all 67 of Florida's counties, we get this figure. Guess who sticks out yet again? On the axis at the bottom, we see how many people voted for president in each county, marked 100,000, 300,000, and 500,000. And on the y-axis, we see that proportion I was just talking about people who voted in person minus the people who voted by mail. The dotted lines act as a corral for reasonable conclusions. What this does is account for the smaller counties where one person's vote makes a larger impact than another person's vote in a much larger county. Looking at the other counties around the size of Palm Beach, we can see they fit well within these prediction lines in the narrow part towards the right, meaning that there really wasn't much of a difference between the amount of people voting for Buchanan when they voted in mail versus in person. So people voting in person for Pat Buchanan in Palm Beach County were strangely enthusiastic when compared not only to all the other counties in Florida, the 3,000 other counties in the United States, but also compared to the other voters within Palm Beach County itself, who voted by mail-in ballot, unless the butterfly ballot caused them to make a mistake. Alright, so our scientists have shown that a weird number of people voted for Pat Buchanan. How do we know that these people who mistakenly voted for Pat Buchanan were Democrats? What if they were Republicans who did the same thing somehow? So we gotta find a way to watch the Democratic voters vote, but not on the butterfly ballot. Thankfully, another very important race is going on at the same time, the race for Florida senator. And this race did not use the butterfly ballot. So if the butterfly ballot did not cause Democratic voters to make mistakes, we'd expect them to vote for the Senate candidate of Pat Buchanan's party, the Reform Party, instead of the Democrat Senate candidate. Going back once again to high school math, we might remember what a slope is. The rise over the run of a line on a graph, where a positive slope would mean a positive association between x and y variables, and a negative slope would mean a negative association between the two variables. And this table shows us those associations. The numbers we care about are in this first line next to all precinct, where we see 2.06 and negative 12.74. If we turn this table into a graph, the x-axis would have support for the Reform Party presidential candidate Pat Buchanan, whereas you move to the right, you gain more and more support for Pat Buchanan. On the y-axis, we have support for the matching Reform Party Senate candidate, whereas you move up, you increase the amount of support you have for that Senate candidate. If the butterfly ballot had nothing to do with the votes of the Democratic Party voters, we would see a line that slopes upward, because as we have so much support for Pat Buchanan, we also have more and more support for the Reform Party Senate candidate to go with him. But because the slope of this line is actually negative 12.74, the line slopes downward, which means as you have more support for Pat, you have less support for his matching senator. It was also found that Democrats who voted for the Democratic Senate candidate were 6 times more likely to vote for Pat on the butterfly ballot. The other number we cared about, the 2.06, showed us that as we had more support for Pat, we had more support for the Democratic Senate candidate. Now that just doesn't make sense. There aren't records of Republican voters voting for their senator and then Pat Buchanan. And also, Pat Buchanan never bought an ad and never visited Palm Beach County, Florida. Now we know that it was the Democratic Party voters in Palm Beach who mistakenly voted for Pat Buchanan rather than anyone else. We can use the absentee ballots sent in by mail and the Senate race again by taking the fact that 89% of those people who voted for the Democratic Senate candidate by mail also voted for Al Gore for president, and then further conclude that at least 2,000 of the 2,300 votes that went to Buchanan were actually meant for Al Gore. This would be enough to turn Florida to Gore and change the entire outcome of the 2000 presidential election. Let's run back through what led us to this conclusion. First, the scientists noticed that Palm Beach, Florida, compared to every other county that they measured in the United States, was weirdly supportive of Pat Buchanan. Then they zoomed in and noticed that Palm Beach was still weird when you compared it to other Florida counties. And we zoomed in even further, showing that it was Democrat voters in the presidential election in Palm Beach County that were giving unprecedented support for the Reform candidate for President Pat Buchanan. Evidence tells us that those Democrat voters who voted for Pat Buchanan did not care about the Reform Senate, and that's because they didn't actually care about Pat Buchanan. The butterfly ballot simply tricked them into doing so. Based on this paper, we can reasonably conclude that the butterfly ballot caused enough confusion among Democratic Party voters to lose Al Gore the presidential election in 2000. This concludes the information I'll present about this paper, so let's move into the after party. Whether you're a college student who had to read this paper for a class and is attending lecture in the next 24 hours and want to impress your professor and peers with your analytical reasoning, or a person who wants to include more academic sources and how they think about life, here are some questions for you to think about. How does this paper relate to what you talked about last week? Did you have lunch with a friend and talk about something that relates in some way? Or does this paper have anything to do with what you talked about in lecture last week or connect to any media you've seen? For me, I think about how much advertising I saw after some US states introduced ranked choice voting and wondered if somebody had read this paper or thought back to the 2000 election. Or what about this? Does the conclusion of this paper change how you think about American politics? How about global politics? Does it change how you think about our voting system? Does it change how you think about political strategy? And finally, how does the conclusion of this paper change your outlook on the things you care about most? Does it at all? Should it? Feel free to leave your answers in the comments and maybe your observations on how this information behaves in the wild. Or keep it to yourself. I won't pry. Anyways, see you later!